I think one thing looking back was I was really nervous about doing all the high reviews at first. And I think I'm not sure if I just got more confident as the process went on, or I just realized that the questions were usually pretty simple and low stakes. I think the best thing you can do is just try and be relaxed during those, virtual interviews, because in reality, I think they're really just assessing your ability to speak fluently as opposed to assessing the quality or the rightness of your answers, so to speak.
Welcome to the Breaking Into Finance podcast. Let's dive in. Aaron, thank you so much for hopping on. I guess maybe to start, do you mind just giving a super short background on you and maybe how we first met and know each other?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me on, Craig. I guess there's a little bit of background. We first met around a month and a half ago on Middlebury's campus at Flatbread Pizza. You came back to campus, speaking to a lot of different students and different leaders of different clubs, and kind of explain your mission with the podcast, and ultimately trying to give students, especially undergrad students, a little bit more exposure to the financial industry. And I think that definitely resonated with me, especially going through the journey myself a few years ago and trying to ultimately sift through the different career paths and the different strategies to ultimately break into finance and break into investment banking. So glad to finally be able to kind of contribute a little bit, maybe tell my story. A little bit of background about myself. I'm currently from Summit, New Jersey. Ultimately came to Middlebury because I was recruited to run track and field, stopped running this year. And in terms of my interest in finance, it really picked up, I would say, early during the pandemic. I was a senior in high school. Right when COVID started, I was home from school with remote classes. And I remember noticing the stock market start to wildly fluctuate. I don't really have any family in the industry. So I remember, asking my parents, what the heck's going on, and didn't really get a straight answer. So I kind of tried to figure it out for myself, opened up my own Robinhood account, lost a lot of money, but ultimately realized that this was something I had somewhat of an interest in. So carried that to Middlebury, joined the student investment committee, didn't really know a thing about it freshman year. Joined the financial institutions group, got some mentorship from the portfolio manager of that group, and have pretty much rode that all the way through. And I'm now the co-president with James Orr, another Middlebury student right now. And then I guess banking specifically, I think that was obviously it's Middlebury's, I would say, its strongest recruiting pipeline. And I think I really did have an interest in, being able to learn more about how different businesses operate, gaining some of that, more mechanical skill set of financial valuation, analysis, accounting. And I also think it's pretty unique, coming out of college. I know it might sound a little bit cliche, but to actually be able to, work on, your day-to-day tasks that actually impact a company's trajectory. And I thought that was, a really unique position to be in relative to every other field, I would say, within finance coming out of undergrad.
Awesome. Yeah. And now you, I guess, did intern at Morgan Stanley, and you'll be going back there full time. Let's talk a little bit about that journey from the Robinhood YOLOs to investment banking. And I think one question that I think a lot of people have is where to get started and how to discover an interest kind of in whatever it is that draws you to the field. Because I think, sometimes just transparently, it's literally like, I hear they pay a lot. Sometimes it's like, I'm a competitive person. I understand that this is the competitive field, so let me go compete. And then for other people, there's just like a thing that draws them to it. And for me, it was, just being interested in how the world works. Like that was like the pull for me. Was I took a couple of econ classes, and I felt like the financial system was a little bit abstracted away. And I was just like, man, I feel like money is governing a lot of decision making, and I want to learn more about, what governs all that. But curious, like what was the thing for you that was like, man, I want to learn more about this? And maybe it was losing all your money on your Robinhood bets, but.
Yeah, I think the first thing was, unfortunately, I think myself, like starting off as a teenager in high school, like there was definitely an urge to kind of, find the hidden treasure. And I think going on the internet and seeing these really optimistic pitches for certain companies that may be very speculative was something that caught my eye. And oftentimes those pitches have a lot of, false reasoning associated with it, but that definitely interested me in terms of like the way in which someone kind of thought about, a company's potential growth prospects, and ultimately, using those assumptions and putting them into a valuation. And I think that was kind of the first thing that caught my interest, and the kind of the first way I kind of learned the basics of how to value a company, how to potentially look at it and see, how maybe your opinion differs from like the market, and, trying to maybe make profit off of the difference between your opinions and, the consensus opinions.
And once you are entering with that mindset of like, now you have like a framework for evaluating this stuff, what were kind of the first things you did to try to actually, learn about this?
Yeah, I think, starting off, a lot of times it would be I'd read something, I wouldn't know what the metric or the term meant, and then I would quickly Google it. So I think Investopedia was one website that was, really helpful. It pretty much has definitions of almost every, concept or term within finance. And then also, YouTube. I mean, there's definitely maybe too many videos out there, but I think there's definitely a good amount of content where if you look up like, what is a PE ratio or what is a discounted cash flow analysis, there's definitely some pretty simple explanations for those things, because I'm definitely more of a, visual learner rather than an auditory learner rather than a visual learner. And I think being able to hear someone else explain something was very helpful for me.
Are there any particular, I mean, maybe it was just like one off, like you Googled the term and find a video. Were there any particular channels or single people that you thought were really good at explaining certain concepts?
Yeah, I think there was a video by Bill Ackman, actually. It was like the financial statements in 40 minutes. I think that was actually the first video I watched, not knowing who he was at the time either. I'm like, oh, wow, this guy's...
place to go. Yeah. All right,
so that was one helpful person.
I'll have to link to that in the show notes after this. As you're now learning about this stuff, you've seen a couple of videos. Now you're, that's the education component. That's the interest component. The next two things are, getting that, job experience and resume building. I'm curious for you, I guess, because your first internship, that was the Anka funds.
100%. And I guess in terms of that first internship with Anka funds, I think one thing that I realized later in the process, which I didn't totally realize right away, was that when you're an underclassman or finishing up your freshman or sophomore year, it doesn't really matter the brand name or the size of the company that you're working for. I think most recruiters really just care about seeing that you put some level of energy into trying to find some sort of learning experience, whether that's, working in some sort of maybe operations role at a bulge bracket bank, which is pretty rare, or just working for a smaller investment firm such as Anka funds, or even just shadowing someone in insurance or accounting. I think that's extremely valuable and honestly gets viewed the same, I think, ultimately when you're going through that junior year recruiting process.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And how did you get that job, out of curiosity? Like, did you have to do a level of prep and resume building first, or how did that come together?
That was actually my mom's brother. Honestly, he buys duplexes and triplexes with him and one other partner out in North Carolina. And I just asked him, hey, is there any chance I can, shadow and, take a stab at some of the financial models that you guys built? So it was definitely a pretty informal, to say the least. But I think just being able to that was my first stab at Excel, actually, after freshman year. And I think being able to, really just kind of look at what people do and the value and the reasoning why people build these models was very eye-opening to me.
That's awesome. And then as you think about, so then your second summer, now as a sophomore, get this internship at Prudential. And I guess the question is, as you were applying for that job, how much did just the fact that you had any experience the prior summer matter versus, you mentioned it's like not like a brand name thing, like the existence of the experience and just like the demonstrated effort versus like what you actually learned? Like, how much of it was it both, or like one versus the other?
I think it was showing like patterns in your resume. So I think, I didn't have anything that's really stood out crazy on my resume, but it was like, okay, this kid, he did an internship after his freshman summer at a small kind of lower name, no name place. He's also part of the student investment committee and went from being a regular member to like a senior analyst, which is also a pretty low ranking title. I was also part of Tamid group at Middlebury, ended up running that first semester. So I think having like just a couple signs on my resume that showed like that I was interested in like actively trying to learn more about, finance and business in general, I think was enough that, potentially made my resume stand out as opposed to maybe other candidates.
And now, sitting here with a few more years of experience, if you're giving advice to, a first semester freshman who's, saying like, hey, I have no idea where to begin, and I know I want to build the right resume. I want to build the right learning platform to show well. Particularly even thinking about these kind of sophomore interviews. Are there any other experiences or things that friends of yours or peers did where you're like, man, that was smart, I wish I did that, or just other strategies or advice you might give to someone who is starting from nothing but maybe has a year and a few months time horizon to get to that level?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I was told, which I think isn't the flashiest advice, but is to pick up the low hanging fruit. So I think, our investment fund, for example, I think most schools, there's no tryout or application. You can just join it and be a part of a pitch. So I think immediately after one semester, you have a pitch that you worked on and you have some analysis. And I think that already, fills up, a sixth or a seventh of your resume. You can join a consulting club as well. So you could have, 2 extracurriculars immediately after one semester. And I think a lot of schools also, locally, at least at Middlebury College, maybe different in less rural areas, you can work for a local business, usually unpaid, but the school may subsidize, a couple $1,000s or some sort of stipend for your work there. And that also is another way to get some sort of real world internship experience as an underclassman, when it may be a little bit more challenging to work for a Fortune 500 company as a 19-year-old.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, just that low hanging fruit comment. It's just, you got to start somewhere, and it's always hard, but anything is better than nothing, I feel like. Yeah. Especially for those early experiences. I want to pivot now to talking about the Morgan Stanley internship process. And I know you're still a student, you don't represent, the opinions of Morgan Stanley, et cetera, but just hearing, just from your personal standpoint, things that stood out about that application process, the interview process, things that you did that you were particularly proud of having prepped. Maybe we can start there.
Definitely. I think their recruiting process was pretty standard with other large bulge bracket banks, where they had a higher view interview first. When I was recruiting, it was, I think March 15th was when the application opened. Okay. And then around April, I got a follow-up email from them telling me about the higher view.
Okay. And so did you already have the Prudential, you already had the Prudential internship lined up, but hadn't started it yet? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Great. So you have that lined up. Your talking points are what you will learn, but you haven't learned anything yet. So yeah. So sorry. So let's get to that. So you do the higher view. By the way, any particular hot takes or opinions on the higher view, or anything that most people don't already know about it before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I guess quick summary, there's usually 2 or 3 questions they'll get asked, why the bank, why, the certain division, whether it's banking or sales and trading. And then maybe one sort of brain teaser or mental exercise, how would you go about figuring out how many planes were in the sky? And there's no real right answer. It's more so to kind of gauge how you think. And I think one thing looking back was I was really nervous about doing all the higher views at first. And I think, I'm not sure if I just got more confident as the process went on, or I just realized that the questions were usually pretty simple and low stakes. I think the best thing you can do is just try and be relaxed during those, virtual interviews, because in reality, I think they're really just assessing your ability to speak fluently as opposed to assessing the quality or the rightness of your answers, so to speak.
I think that's such an important point, because and this is the biggest difference, I think, between interviews and even that first banking job versus a lot of what you do in college is, all of a sudden you're not getting graded based on written words, but based on just verbal and interpersonal communication. And that's going to be so important during your job when you're delivering, insights to clients, when you're trying to, describe complex analyses or opinions to people. But then especially for the interview, it's not just can you do the math in Excel? Because for these investment banking interviews, there's no like Excel work. It's literally like, can you speak to all of these kind of technical questions or even non-technical questions? And so really having composing yourself in a way that, you're ready to be persuasive to someone versus if you're like jittery and nervous, it's really hard to convince someone that, you're confident and know what you're talking about.
Oh, definitely. And I guess a little bit of a side topic, but I think the last interview I had at a different bank, the last question was like explain investment banking to a toddler. And I think like right when you hear that, I mean, it's one of those things where you might understand all the nuts and bolts, but actually being able to explain it quickly can actually sometimes be harder than you realize at first.
Yeah, and those are like always my favorite interview questions, honestly, are the ones where I try to parse, did you just memorize all the right things versus like, do you actually understand the concept and the topic? So we make it through the higher view, and that's great higher view advice. Moving to, next round. Any questions you still remember? I never remember the ones that I did well, but I really remember all the questions that I just botched. Any fun stories there?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I think my first, right before the Morgan Stanley process, I think I had an early interview or not early, but I guess Green Hill at the time when they were a standalone bank. They had like a really early process that I, spoke to a couple of alumni at Middlebury for and got an interview like the next day or 2 days later. And it was for the, I think the distress group they had there. And it was all, pen and paper, very technical. It is good sometimes to recruit for places that you might even think at the moment, like especially coming from a liberal arts school, it may be above your, quote unquote pay grade. But I think it kind of gives you confidence and desensitizes you from like the fear of having questions that you can't answer. Because I'm pretty sure, myself and most people included, we'll have a time in an interview where you can't answer a question. And I think not having the nerves before that happens really helps you kind of answer questions, more clearly and not have your brain kind of wondering, are you overthinking it or not? And I think that's something that I found to be helpful, getting that out of the way early.
For that junior year internship, how many different places did you apply to, out of curiosity?
Yeah, I think I applied to about 15, but there was really only like 6 or 7 that I was like really confident with, or not confident, but just had really invested a lot of time with based on like the alumni network at Middlebury.
Yeah, that, and like I would guess that, Morgan Stanley, if not like being at the top of that list of like prestige or whatever, is like at or near the top. And one other thing that I really want to encourage people to do is just like apply everywhere, because one, it's a little bit of a crapshoot and you never know. 2, you'll just get great. Interviewing is a skill, not like some innate trait, and you get better at it the more you do. And just getting those reps really helps. And then 3, you'll have a fun story like I do of like, man, all of these random firms that nobody's ever heard of just like flat rejecting me. Or even worse, like I get to like an in-person interview and I just like totally, eat shit and just like disaster. I think I went through at least 3 like just people staring me in the face disasters. And the biggest one that stands out is there's actually one, I had 3 back-to-back interviews, and the first person like comes in and I could just tell by her body language that she was very disappointed with my answers to like 2 questions. And then the next 2 people that came in, they like didn't even ask me questions. They like sat in the room and were like on their BlackBerry, like messaging, because they like got prepped that like this kid's useless and it's like not even worth like asking him questions. So I won't name the firm where that happened, but I think like those experiences are important and they like help you, learn and like do better. And that is also to say that like, I hope people who are listening to this know that like, if you get like rejected from like one place, that doesn't mean you shouldn't apply to places that you perceive as being more competitive because of that, just because there's so much noise and all this stuff.
On that same note, I feel like a lot of people, myself included, were almost afraid to, reach out to the full-time analyst, like to really start networking because of like the fear that you may have a bad call with someone at a bank. And
yes.
I guess similarly, just having one, so-so call doesn't mean that, everyone at the bank's going to think you're worthless or you're not qualified. I mean, obviously if you have a disaster call or you show that you're not interested or rude, that may get back to other people. But I think just showing a genuine interest in trying to learn, I don't think anyone's going to really knock you for that. And I think that was one thing that, I definitely learned over time going through the process.
Yeah. The rudeness is way worse than the not knowing anything.
Mm-hmm.
At least I think that's been the sense of most people that I've chatted with. But yeah, so let's move on. You've gotten past the hire view. Let's talk about kind of the rest of that interview process for MS specifically.
Yeah, so after the hire view, there was a first round phone screening. So it was a 30-minute phone call with, I believe, like an associate or a VP at the bank. There were some behavioral questions like why Morgan Stanley, why investment banking, and then there was some almost like a case in terms of, and I had this actually at a few banks where rather than explicitly asking you like walk me through the line items of an income statement or balance sheet, it was assume there's a shoe store in your college town, walk me through what the annual revenue might look like, and that's kind of, I guess, one, testing your ability to kind of maybe break down the market size, but also being able to, point out the line items, on an income statement or like what, depreciation expenses might look like for a shoe store, things like that. So I think it was a little more qualitative, but at the same time kind of forced you to try and apply what maybe you learned on a guide to like the real world or in a different scenario.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I guess how long was there between the phone screen and your super day? Like, was it like the next day? Did you have a few weeks? Like how much prep time did you have?
I believe I heard back like a week or so later, maybe 5 or 7 days later. And then once I got that follow-up email saying that I had a super day, it was scheduled for 1 week from then. So about 2 weeks between the first round and the super day interview.
All right. And then obviously you go through, you get the internship, you go through the internship, and you get the full-time offer, which by the way, in kind of a tough summer for that. So big kudos to you on getting, like, I think, some summers and a lot of big firms try to be respectful of people. And like, if you do a good job, you get an offer. But I do know some like good people, this summer who didn't get that offer. So first, congratulations to you on making it through that hurdle. And then I guess the second question is just, any advice or strategies of like, how to do well in the internship?
Definitely. I think the biggest thing that I tried to at least convey was just interest and like that I really cared. And I think that was the same strategy I had in, those networking calls and interviews when, coming from Middlebury, great academic school, but it's less pre-professionally focused than, U Chicago or Wharton or some of those other more finance heavy undergrad programs. And I think I wanted to come across as someone who like, came in early every day, left late, asked for additional work, was trying to improve day in and day out, even if I started maybe a little bit behind the other summer analysts in my group. And I think that also allows you to kind of take a little bit less pressure on yourself of being, super accurate and super knowledgeable from day one. And I think they really value like your growth over the summer as opposed to, your starting point and like your ending point compared to everyone else. It's more so like where you finished compared to where you started.
Yeah. And then I guess, we've covered a lot already, but any other, before we part, any other pieces of advice or things that, you wished you knew, 1, 2, 3 years ago?
Trying to think. I think the best thing that I guess learned going through the process is how much better you get through repetition and through like practice. So I think like the more conversations you have on the phone with analysts, at first it almost feels like you're just doing it because you're told you're supposed to. But I think once you get through, 15, 20, 30, 40 phone calls, it doesn't really feel like an audition anymore. And it actually feels like you're asking like genuine questions and are actually learning everything through, from every conversation that you have, sequentially. So I think, at first it's always going to be uncomfortable to finally call that first analyst who's, 3 or 4 years older than you. And you're going to feel like you're, kind of faking your knowledge of the industry, which everyone I think feels at some point and in some degree. But I think the earlier you start that, the more prepared and the more comfortable you'll feel come, February, March, April, when the interviews start to roll through, I would say.
Perfect. Well, Aaron, I think that's great advice to close on. Thank you so much again for coming on and doing this. And also, I don't know what day we're going to post this, but for everybody who's listening, we're recording this on like a Friday night, your time, Aaron. So definitely appreciate you giving up the first part of your Friday to record this for me, since I'm off in California on Pacific time and you're in Vermont.
Yeah. Now, of course, probably a little warmer where you are right now, but
that's true.
It'll do.
Awesome. Well, Aaron, thank you so much again. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks again, Craig. Have a great.
That does it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. And remember to check out our website, breakingintofinancepodcast.com, where you can submit questions, join our Substack to stay up to date on new content releases, and much, much more. We'll see you next time.